All right, here we go with section 7 and the focus question. The Bush administration's foreign policy statements shocked the world. Immediately after September 11th, much of the world sympathized with the United States and supported the U.S. invasion in Afghanistan as a legitimate response to terrorist attacks. By late 2002, however, many feared that the United States was claiming the right to act as a world policeman in violation of international law. Some warned that relations between Europe and the United States were worsening because the United States was dismissing the perspectives of other nations. Some critics wondered if U.S. strategy was repeating the mistakes of the Cold War and argued that anti Americanism was rooted not in hatred of American freedoms, but in opposition to specific U.S. policies toward Israel, the Palestinians, and the corrupt and undemocratic regimes in the Middle East. Some critics charged that the United States was bent on becoming a new global empire. The attacks of September 11th showed not just U.S. vulnerability, but the nation's overwhelming strength as well. The United States, in economic, cultural, and military terms, was far ahead of the rest of the world. Its defense budget exceeded that of the 20 next nations combined. It maintained military bases throughout the world and had a navy on every ocean. After September 11th, the word empire, once a term of abuse, came into widespread use. Some argued that the United States had to shoulder the burdens of empire, talk that worried those at home and abroad who felt that the United States should not reshape the world in its image. The Bush administration's next initiative intensified these tensions. The Iraqi dictatorship of Saddam Hussein survived its defeat in the 1991 Gulf War, and his opponents charged Hussein with developing new weapons in violation of UN resolutions. From its start, the Bush administration included a group of conservative policymakers, including Vice President Dick Cheney, Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, and Deputy Defense Secretary Paul D. Wolfowitz, who were determined to remove Hussein from power. They developed a military strategy to accomplish this: massive airstrikes followed by a small ground invasion. They believed Iraqis would welcome the U.S. Army as liberators and quickly establish a democratic government, allowing the United States to withdraw its troops. This group seized on September 11th as an opportunity to implement this plan, and President Bush adopted their outlook. Secretary of State Colin Powell, who thought the conquest and stabilization of Iraq would require hundreds of thousands of troops and should not be attempted without allies, became marginalized. Though Hussein was not an Islamic fundamentalist and no known evidence linked him to the September 11th attacks, the Bush administration announced its intent to accomplish regime change in Iraq. Administration spokespeople insisted that Hussein should be removed from power because he had developed an arsenal of chemical and bacterial weapons of mass destruction and was trying to acquire nuclear arms. U.S. newspaper and television journalists repeated these claims without investigating them. The UN Security Council agreed to step up weapons inspections, but the Bush administration argued that inspectors would never uncover Hussein's arsenal. Early in 2003, despite misgivings, Secretary of State Powell made an address to the United Nations claiming that Hussein possessed chemical weapons and was trying to acquire uranium in Africa to build nuclear weapons. Every one of these claims turned out to be false. The U.S. decision to engage in the Iraq War split the Western alliance and inspired massive anti-war protests around the world. In February 2003, between 10 and 15 million people across the world protested the imminent war. Large-scale protests in the United States brought together those who believed that waging war against a nation just because it might pose a security threat in the future violated international law and the UN Charter. Foreign policy realists warned that the administration's obsession with Iraq distracted the United States from its real foe, al-Qaeda, which could still launch terror attacks, and insisted that the United States could not unilaterally transform the Middle East into a bastion of democracy, as the administration claimed was its long-term aim. Both traditional foes of the United States, such as Russia and China, and traditional allies, such as Germany and France, refused to support a preemptive war against Iraq. Unable to get UN approval for attacking Iraq, the United States went to war anyway in March 2003, with Great Britain as its single significant ally. President Bush called the war Operation Iraqi Freedom and said its goal was to defend our freedom and bring freedom to others. Hussein's government quickly fell to U.S. military forces. After hiding for several months, Hussein was captured and put on trial. In 2006, he was found guilty of ordering the killing of many Iraqis during his rule, sentenced to death, and executed. Soon after the fall of Baghdad, a triumphant President Bush appeared under a banner reading "Mission Accomplished." Yet after Hussein's fall, everything seemed to go wrong, including looting and chaos, and an insurgency quickly developed that attacked American soldiers and cooperating Iraqis. Sectarian violence swept through Iraq, and despite holding a number of elections in Iraq, the United States found it impossible to create a government capable of exerting control and imposing order. By early 2007, polls showed that most Americans thought the invasion was a mistake and that the war was a lost cause. In 2011, President Barack Obama withdrew U.S. troops from Iraq. Though an insurgency in 2014 brought some U.S. troops back to Iraq, President Biden withdrew the remainder in 2021. So that's the end of Section 7. We'll be back for Section 8.